Good evening. I am Eromitha Ramesh, and I'm here to take you through the journey of the river Cooum in Chennai. In your visit in the city, you might have overlooked this river, assuming it to be sewage. And in some places, you might have not even seen it because of the huge compound walls that have managed to tuck it away from the city. But what if I told you that this polluted river is the reason why the city of Chennai actually came to be? And the Cooum Conundrum is an idea, an exploration into understanding how we build along ecologically and culturally sensitive zones like river bodies in increasingly urbanizing cities like Chennai. Such a primal experience of touching water is so uncommon in this city. One of the wettest in India with 3 rivers, 5 wetlands, and multiple lakes. But an experience with recurring floods and droughts is a common one. Why is that? We will see through the tale of Cooum in Chennai. We lived as people that considered the river Cooum holy and an integral part of our lives. These river edges were our commons and our shared spaces. Madras, now Chennai, grew along the banks of the river Cooum. The river is the locus of the city and its people. With time, the relationship between the city and the river changed, and soon there came up walls separating the city, the river, and its people. The river system soon fell prey to the desire of urbanization, and the indiscriminate commons now turned into the backyards of the city.
Drainage.
மக்களோட கழிவு போகிற தண்ணி.
கூவம்னா நார் ஏரியா தான் சொல்லுவாங்க.
தான் இருந்தது நல்லா. அதுல தண்ணி எடுத்து சாப்பாடு சேர்ந்து சாப்பிட்ட தண்ணி ரொம்ப கஷ்டமா இருந்தது. ஒரு இந்த ஜிஹெச்சி வீந்தவங்க பாடியெல்லாம் பாதிங்க வந்து ஸ்மெல்லு.
ஒரு மஞ்சா காமல் எங்கள் வீட்டிலே பசங்களுக்கெல்லாம் அந்த மாதிரி வந்தது. நானே வந்து இன்னும் சிக்கன் குனியா கால் வலி இன்னும் அப்படியே இருக்குது, நடக்க முடியல எனக்கு சரியா கால்.
எதுக்கு என்ன வியாதி வருதுன்றதை கண்டுபிடிக்க முடியல. உங்களாலேயும் சொல்ல முடியாது, எங்களாலேயும் சொல்ல முடியாது. இதெல்லாம் வந்து தலையெழுத்துன்னா அனுபவிச்சு தான் ஆகணும். என்ன
உண்மையான ஒரு மிகப்பெரிய அடையாளம் சென்னைக்கு.
இதை வந்து க்ளீன் பண்ணால் நல்லா இருக்குது.
கழிவுநீர் பாதை அமைக்கணும், நதியே வந்து சாக்கடையாக்கிட்டோம்.
தனியாக ஒரு லைன் ஒரு கவர்மெண்ட் உருவாக்கி கூவமாக்கிய கங்கை நீரை சுத்தம் பண்ண மாதிரி சுத்தமாக அரசாங்கம் முயற்சி பண்ணால் ஒரு தூய்மையான சென்னையாக நம்ம பார்க்கலாம்.
I grew up in Chennai as well, and I thought that Cooum was sewage. But that was until I got to know about the story of the river and how we've lived along its banks. With the loss of a river like this, we not only lose the ecological significance, but also a strong cultural and social aspect. These edges are mine as much as they're yours. These are inclusive spaces that are shared by all creatures alike in the city. And hence, isn't it important to break these barriers and stitch the fragments left out? We now see how we've occupied land along the edge of the river and how the floodplains are being used for urbanization. To add to this, there's an upcoming infrastructure in Chennai, which is a double-decker expressway that runs along a significant stretch along the river. We know that urban infrastructure of this kind have a tendency to create urban fractures, and hence, if these interfaces are not handled with care, the situation of the river and its banks can only become worse. We see the different kind of buildings and their backyards that dot the river Cooum that shows the heterogeneity along the river. We are now interested in Cooum in Egmore. Egmore is one of the oldest localities in Chennai and a significant urban center. It has important administrative buildings, cultural buildings, residential buildings, offices, educational institutions. And it makes for an interesting area of study because this initially used to be a small hamlet that thrived along the banks of the river Cooum, the same banks that have now become polluted and uninhabitable. We now quickly go to our site. We identify 3 main program anchors: the Lalit Kala Academy, which has art galleries and art studios; the Spencer's Plaza, one of the oldest malls in India and has strong cultural associations with the river; and the Government Egmore Museum, which also is a cultural building. A number of educational institutions and offices dot the area as well. We see how the different buildings in the expressway would sit on site. All right. Now, if we were to take a walk along Etirat Saleh, we see that there's absolutely no perception of the river. Rather, we're greeted with tall compound walls and heaps of garbage dumped along the banks. But what does Etirat Saleh really look like throughout the day? We have people from offices, educational institutions occupying the streets, interacting with street vendors, taking a break, waiting for their cab. A strong sense of public along this area. But if these river edges are our commons and public spaces, why aren't people here, right? And this is because they have now been turned into the backyards of the city. And to add to this, we also have the expressway coming up along the stretch. What has the government done about it? It has set up the Cooum River Restoration Trust in order to revitalize the river. The two aspects of which that we're interested is the sewage and sanitation, where there are two plants on either proximities of the site, and an eco trail that is coming up along one of the edges. This gives us an idea of the larger framework in which our site sits. We then begin to wonder why we look at river edges as long stretches of land and water. Aren't these much more than that? Can we look at them as smaller segments and therefore microcosms of their own? And in doing that, we would be able to look at them from a bottom-up approach. What is the conundrum, right? It is that the sync between the river, the people, and the city has been lost. And the idea of this exploration is to bring them back in sync and make them work as partners with one another. And yes, urbanization is inevitable, but can we make that go hand in hand with ecology and leverage the space underneath these flyovers as public spaces? Can we look at the river from a bottom-up approach, and in doing so, we'll be able to understand the smaller, intimate relationships that the river has with that particular neighborhood. And in learning that, we will get a better understanding of how to build along these river edges and how our backyards can sit along these river edges. And in doing that, we'll be able to understand the dynamic relationship between the river, the people, and therefore the city. How do we build? Yes, these areas are our commons, and so can we negotiate the existing boundaries that the river has with the city? From our earlier case studies, we see that we look at river edges as beautified, concretized, hard walkways along the river, but they strip the river of its natural tendencies. And hence, can we look at architecture as controlled, localized interventions? Can we build as a part of nature? And in doing that, can we convert these inaccessible backyards into softer biodiversity zones that are shared by people, all creatures, and the river and the city? Is there a possibility of integrating sponge landscapes that help manage water better in such dense urban scenarios? To understand the bottom-up approach better, we look at the idea of urban wild ecology, which focuses on the disconnected parts rather than the transcendent wholes. And in doing that, we identify 6 different locations that have very different associations with the river. And these help connect and negotiate the river back to the city. And this is how the architectural manifestation of these interventions would look. We now go to our first site. On one side of the river, there's Etirat Saleh, as mentioned before, with a strong sense of public. On the other side, there's a low to middle income group housing that has women and children, people occupying the upper stretches of the river, and there's a strong program anchor like Lalit Kala Academy. And this is the existing state of the banks. What can we do? Can we bridge people and program across the river with the help of a pedestrian bridge and a cultural center? And can that have a layer of sponge landscape associated to it? We now see the impact that these interventions could create. These mounds could now turn into spaces that can host exhibitions from the Lalit Kala Academy and into daily public spaces for the people of the local neighborhood. We see how the pedestrian bridge would sit across the banks over mounds, and how the orientation and the rhythm at which these wooden structures allow for various activities to happen along the river. We see the junction between the expressway and the bridge that allows for various cultural activities to happen. We now go to the cultural center that aims at doing 3 major things: work as an extension of the context, be ecologically sensitive, and climate responsive. We see how the built is lifted off the ground, and the mounds at the bottom now work as a plaza. The build has 3 major components: the permeable skin, the solid built, and the in-between spaces. We see that this intervention now looks into the river rather than the other buildings that have turned their backs against it. The various programs include art studios, theater performance studios, multipurpose halls, libraries, and collaborator spaces. And these are extension of programs that already exist in the neighborhood. We see how the art studios sit with the backdrop of the trees on site and an extension of the Government Egmore Museum. we see how these art studios look into the river and sit as an extension of programs of the Lalit Kala Academy, and how the collaborative spaces allow and invite various other office-going people and the public into the space. We now look at the permeable skin that has a fin that allows for the building to open and close owing to the monsoon in Chennai and the hot and humid climate. But there are also spaces in between that allow for people to occupy. We then wonder if these spaces are only restricted to humans. Not really. When ecosystems of this kind are revived, it is expected that birds like household sparrows return. And in that case, can our interventions house these birds along with people as a part of the city and the river? When it rains, the facade of the whole building would close and the mounds would work as sponge landscapes. We move on to our second site, where we have large institutions with backyards that are connected to the river, but again, in this case, is broken by this huge compound wall. What can we do? Can we negotiate the idea of this boundary physically, programmatically, and in terms of ownership? And can we do that with the help of an existing compound wall where it can be made flexible with an intervention such that the backyard of these buildings could be a part of the institutions in the mornings and the evenings could be opened out as a public space along the river? We see the impact of how these backyards have now turned into reclaimed commons of the city. We do that with the help of three major ideas of hinge, rotate, and slide. And we see how these backyards, like you see, have turned into public spaces, and the compound wall hosts activities. This module can be replicated along multiple compound walls, and the backyards of more buildings could be turned into sponge landscapes. They could work together to manage water better. We move on to the third site. We have a strong residential neighborhood over here. We have kids, and we have the river. Can we put these ideas together to create play along the river, where the mounds turn into play areas for the kids and also work as sponge landscapes to manage water during monsoon? We see the impact that these backyards could truly create. Fourth site, we have the flyover and the space underneath it, a strong sense of public along Ethiraj Sale, and the river. Can we put these ideas together and create spaces underneath the flyover and leverage them out as public spaces along the river with the help of two interventions, which is the movable walls and the pods? And this is the true potential of these urban voids when placed near the river as a public space. The various configurations and how it would latch on to the pillar of the expressway. Again, this could trigger more backyards to open out to the river, and it could also be dismantled and repurposed elsewhere. The final site, we now come to Mount Road. The two things that we're interested in is Spencer's Plaza, like mentioned, one of the oldest malls in India, and a street right next to it that leads to a park at the back and the river. And this is the existing state of this situation. Can we negotiate the street and integrate it with the plaza in Spencer's and also connect the park with the river at the back with the help of this intervention? We could do that with the help of an event street that sits between two buildings. They could host for impromptu performance spaces, flea markets, and book fair, and could also be a space for daily activities where the homeless could sleep at night. It connects to Mount Road with the help of pop-up stores, and at the back with the help of an open performance space to the river and the park. This intervention can also be dismantled and repurposed elsewhere. We see how the multiple interventions sit with the site as reclaiming commons, and they also allow for various activities and cultural activities and festivities to happen along the river edge that reinforces the idea of the river culturally in the minds of the collective. We see how the spawnscapes would work through time and manage water. Here we have two posters. The one on the left was done before this exploration that talks about the loss of reflection, quite literally water and our identity and the cultural aspects of the river, when we build with the idea of man versus nature. The one on the right is after the exploration that says that urbanization can coexist with ecology if we learn to build as people in nature. And in doing so, an experience like this will no longer be an uncommon one in Chennai. Thank you.